everyone. I am Director of Marketing at Agrify, Rachel Fournier, and I am joined today with Chief Operating Officer Rob Harrison, also from Agrify, and VP of Horticulture and Customer Success at Agrify, David Kessler. And today we are going to talk about cultivation technology and how to grow in a market with evolving technology. And of course, as we all know, the cannabis market has been booming. And of course, cultivation techniques have to move at rapid pace to keep up with this demand. So David, why don't you kick us off with talking to us a little bit about the market?
Absolutely. And thank you so much, Rachel. It's a pleasure to be here with everyone and to get to share my thoughts on technology and cultivation. In terms of the market's evolution, we're obviously in a period of extreme growth. More and more states are coming online. Just this week, West Virginia, as well as New Jersey, announced radical changes to their regulations and will be incorporating legalization of medical or recreational in those states. In general, the markets have evolved in two distinct paths. One is with states that have had restrictive licenses, such as Florida, New York, or Maryland, maybe Nevada, where there's a very limited number of entrants and a very high cost of entry. This leads to a different set of problems than, say, non-restrictive states, such as Washington, Colorado, or Oklahoma, where there are lots of entrants because of the low cost to enter into the cultivation and the cannabis industry. But that also creates a lot of price compression because of all of those competitors in the space. So in restrictive states, there's a huge demand, and because of the limited number of producers, those producers end up becoming very large, what I would call mega producers, over 100,000 square feet of canopy. And this allows them to address the demand, but as that production scales, the trend of wholesale prices go down. And the same is true in those non-restrictive states. With all of the entrants producing cannabis, the wholesale prices tend to trend down lower. You know, in Colorado just last year, originally the market several years ago was as high as $4,000, $5,000 per pound. Last summer, we hit lows for indoor flower around $600. So it's that price compression that entrants and cultivators, operators in the cannabis industry must compete with. And there's a couple of ways they can do that. But in order to find a balance between the inevitable compression and the viability of your business, you need to be able to produce and operate efficiently at scale. So how do we do this? Well, my suggestion and my understanding is that the best way to do this is incorporate technology. The incorporation of technology can allow you to drive your costs of production down, allow you to have increased quality at both scale, as well as increased consistency. You need to adopt best practices from other markets, from other industries. Cannabis cultivation is new for the agricultural community as a legal enterprise, and the data that was around cannabis cultivation really was somewhat delayed because it wasn't allowed as a reasonable research subject. So there's a lot of information, a lot of technology, and a lot of best practices to incorporate to make sure businesses are successful. And then the final thing is really that we have to incorporate data. We have to let the data drive decisions that you're going to make. Understand your own process, your successes, your failures, because you can learn as much from what you did wrong as what you did right. And if you're not recording the data, if you're not looking at your process, then you're not going to be able to progress, to compete as the markets inevitably show that compression and force those efficiencies for the successful operators. Rob, what are your thoughts?
David, I think you're absolutely right. And obviously the market is changing very quickly. It's a very dynamic time. There's a lot of new states being added. There's not a consistent way that products is being produced and states are being run. But I think it's really important to kind of look at the future and where the market's going to be going. Obviously, it's a new market. It's hard to predict the future, but there's some parallels to other industries that are kind of interesting. And one of them that I look at a lot is the beer industry. It's another highly regulated, highly taxed industry that is going to be the same with the cannabis industry. But if you look forward into that market, there's really only two, it's an ultra competitive market, and there's only two types of companies that have been successful. It's the big mass producers and it's the small craft growers. And as you look at the cannabis market, it's very likely that that market will mature in the same way as those markets. So it's interesting for us to look at where the market is evolving and understand how a product is being produced today. And if it does evolve in the same way that the beer industry has evolved, how do you be successful in that model? And if you look at the big mass producers, it's all about scale. It's all about the marketing. It's about consistent product. It's about operational efficiencies and the lowest possible costs. Craft beer is a little bit different. It's about a differentiated product and, creating something unique in those space. So maybe if we talk about the mass producers, David, it'd be interesting to understand your perspective on how the cannabis market needs to operate to be equivalent to the mass producers in the beer industry.
Absolutely. And I think that we can make a very good comparison of the alcohol, the beer industry to the cannabis industry, although it is much more mature, of course. When we're looking at cannabis producers trying to produce at scale, a couple of things come into play. The first is the facilities design, the incorporation of technology, because if you're looking at your long-term success, you have to have long-term viability. And that means things like looking at your operational costs in an ongoing or forward-thinking fashion. When the industry began, everyone was pretty much using HID lighting, high-intensity discharge, or high-pressure sodium and metal halides. These were very energy inefficient and had a low cost to obtain, but a very high cost to operate. As technology has improved, the incorporation of LED lighting, light emitting diodes, which save about 40% of the overall electrical input energy, are becoming much more prevalent. They're being fostered by forward-thinking states that are enacting regulations that are requiring a more conscientious and green, environmentally sound business practices. And even some of the cultivation strategies that growers were comfortable with using this HID lighting are no longer allowed. So you're actually being forced to adopt technology in a lot of states. And if you're already comfortable with that, if you already see the value, if you've already done your market research and you understand how to differentiate, an LED light that might be better for your garage work office over your plants, then you're going to be ahead of the pack.
One of the other things that the beer industry has done is they've done a lot of things with automation, about labor utilization. How can the cannabis industry do some of those things as well?
Absolutely. And so when you're looking at, again, those commercial producers, you have to look at essentially workflow and do a lot of time and motion studies, because what you'll find is which processes are taking your employees, which are taking that most of the time. And then you can look at those through the lens of looking to improve, to minimize that time involvement. So, for example, one of the most critical ones is moving to an automated irrigation schedule or schema, because hand watering plants, while great on a very small scale, commercially it takes up an enormous amount of time and represents added risk, because the lack of uniformity between someone, say, counting to 10 and then moving on to another plant, the flow rate of the pump, the length of the hoses, you end up with a lot of inconsistency, which has a negative impact on the product, both in the quality and then the consistency and repeatability of producing that product from crop to crop. Now, other problems that the scale or large scale beer producers might have that should be thought of for the cannabis industry are the data. When you think about commercial production, these are companies that have dialed in their process. They have recorded data. Every piece of information that they have is relevant, from the temperature the beer is held, to how long it's fermented, to the volumes of sugar. It's not willy-nilly. It's not off of the cuff. These are best practices that have evolved through trial and error and have been adopted and followed very regimentedly. It's why every Coca-Cola tastes the same. It's why every McDonald's Big Mac is identical. And it leads to a very comfortable consumer, because they have an expectation, and every time they have that product, it's met. And that's a huge problem in the cannabis industry right now. Because there is a lack of consistency, consumer experience, patient experience varies greatly. And so I think that one of the prime things that the industry is going to have to address is consistency moving forward, especially as consumers are becoming more demanding and more knowledgeable.
And then I would just agree with your statement. I mean, one of the things that the big beer producers have done is create a brand and create a consistent brand, and that's going to be one of the things that'll drive that market as it goes forward.
Absolutely. And the repeatability, the consistency of the brands are so key. There's a great economist that says in a commodity market, if you're not a brand, you're just a commodity, and you're going to fluctuate with the fluctuations in that commodity market. So right now, while all of the mature markets have generally trended down over time as more entrants either got larger or more entrants entered the space, we are in a unique period right now. COVID has brought into the industry increased demand from consumer groups that didn't before use cannabis. And we're also in a period where we've had some environmental weather phenomena that has really impacted the market, the California and West Coast wildfires, and then a very early snow in Colorado in September that damaged a lot of the outdoor. All of these unmitigated risks influence the industry. And in order to be successful, you have to be able to take advantages of times where there's increased demand and your cost of production allows you to benefit from that, as well as, your cultivation style and strategy needs to allow you to produce even when there are impacts from weather or climate that are beyond your control. And that's how you're going to grow into one of those larger commercial scale operators.
Mm-hmm. So what are the elements in that? Obviously, consistent high yield and consistent low costs are going to be the key to winning in a commoditizing market. What are the factors that a cannabis grower can do to maximize that?
Well, in terms of the higher yield, you need to look at your cultivation technology. You need to look at your strain selection. I always explain that the genetics determine on a scale or a spectrum of where your outcome will be, and it's the level of care, the technology you select that determines where on that spectrum you fall. So first, you have to choose good genetics, things that are disease resistant, that are vigorous. But once you have a genetic selected, it's really about the ability to optimize the cultivation for that particular genetic. And that means figuring out at what temperature it grows best, figuring out at what CO2 levels, how you can maximize its development and the speed of growth through, irrigation management, what we call crop steering. And all of that utilizes technology because you can't really do that kind of tweaking, that kind of very precise cultivation without technology to help you monitor and control that environment.
David, could you talk about that a little bit more about the strains and what the variability is and how that relates back to the consumer? Like we're talking about, medical cannabis and how a strain, expresses itself and how a consumer is using it. Like, why is that so important?
Absolutely. So, especially from a medical perspective, we have to understand that cannabis produces over 550 chemical compounds, 100 plus of which are cannabinoids and over 100 which are terpenes. The interaction of those two compounds having a huge impact on the medical efficacy. So the strain selected, the genetics are going to determine which chemical compounds can be produced, how much THC, how much limonene. If it doesn't code for, say, humulene in the DNA, it will not produce humulene. It just can't. So first, the selection of the genetic and the patient understanding which compounds might benefit them most or which work best for their particular biochemistry. With that said, that's only a little piece of the picture. The real problem is that with 550 different compounds or more, the ratios and the amounts that those compounds are produced are really dictated by the cultivation environment. And so by controlling the cultivation environment and then granularly being able to produce it very precisely, you minimize the variation. So every crop that you have of lemon lava cake is going to be as chemically similar as possible. When you're growing, for example, in a greenhouse and you have supplemental light, so you get 4 or 5 crops a year, the changes in light intensity through the year, just the sun, the changes in the weather, have a huge impact on the chemical profile of the plants produced. So even though the greenhouse is the same, the cultivation practices are the same, the environment not being controlled precisely with precision leads to a lot of variability, what we call phenotypic plasticity, or the fact that the plant's expression is dictated and changes based on the environmental factors. So the key here is for a maturing cannabis industry that is going to start having consumers demanding a more consistent experience, demanding a higher quality product, that they need to both incorporate technology that allows them to control the environment and reproduce that environment very closely. This is going to lead to consistency, and this is going to lead to consumers that are happy, and it's also going to lead to regional and national brands eventually, with legalization changes on the cusp, I hope, that can deliver that consistency across borders.
Well, multi-state operators must already be in need of this, though.
Absolutely, and there's different strategies that some of the multi-state operators are incorporating. Right now, one of the strategies I've seen is acquiring a lot of distressed assets. As I said, there's a lot of players in the industry that have not been able to succeed because of high costs of production and just a lack of awareness of where the market was heading. So, acquiring those distressed assets is great for an MSO, but then they're left with a problem. This was a failing business already. How do I turn it around? And then how do I make it successful like my operations next door, when the buildings themselves, the physical structures are so varied? And so with that, if you can incorporate an inclusive technology such as Agrify that incorporates essentially vertical stacking growth chambers, which regardless of the building envelope can be incorporated and deliver that consistency of process. It allows you high technology, precision agriculture, control of the environment, reproduction of the environment, and ultimately the ability to scale and compete.
So David, you mentioned obviously the inconsistency of these products. Isn't it difficult for these MSOs to grow a consistent brand if their product's not the same from dispensary to dispensary?
It is a huge problem and a huge challenge that all of these MSOs are facing. And some of them have chosen to incorporate different brands in different markets. Others try and have those brands cross the different state lines, but they all suffer from the same challenge, which is this inconsistent product. And the only way we know of to really get consistent product at this point is through consistency of process. And that means the cultivation environment and all of the best practices that go through your cultivation from seed through harvest and drying.
Mm-hmm. So David, obviously from a big brand perspective, a Budweiser in the beer model perspective, it's about operational costs, it's about consistent product, and it's about a consistent brand. But there's another type of market that's critical that's also shown to be effective, which is this craft beer market. These are specialty brewers. There's create a premium product that has a terrific following, and they're really able to create something unique and different that the consumers really resonate to. How could the cannabis market become like that as well?
It's a great question, because I think there is definitely room for different types of producers, right? I think we're always going to have the mass market commercial demand for a lower cost, but consistent quality product. We'll call that, the Budweisers or the Coors Americas. I'm in Colorado of America. But there is another opportunity. It's the craft opportunity. And in fact, some states are actually licensing craft licenses. And what that means is it may be a smaller license that focuses more in on a very high quality niche product and lesser so on just the lowest cost of production and good enough quality. We have a real problem in Colorado with, what some people would call B-grade flower. Or boof. It's essentially, good cannabis, but not great cannabis. So the craft producers are out to differentiate themselves. They're after the differentiated product of high quality. And sometimes this means higher costs of production. Sometimes this means strains that are a little bit more difficult or finicky to grow, that require more care, a little bit of coddling, if you will. And so if you have a variety, for example, Skittles, which is very popular now, it's also well known to be a pain in the butt to grow. And if you get a grow room dialed in enough to grow Skittles, what you'll find is that it's generally a different environment than most of your others are strains are performing well in. And so it makes it difficult to cultivate. And because of that, a craft producer that takes the time to cultivate a strain, to do it well, to learn the nuanced details of how to make a genetic really maximize its potential, that is going to be how they differentiate themselves with this higher quality, this unique terpene profile. And I think that it is going to provide a lot of viability long term. If you look at some of the craft beer as an example, some of these small microbreweries have turned into, state operations, pretty well-known beer producers. And some have even done even more, had more success and are becoming regional or national. Everything from incorporating seasonal varietals, which I think is fantastic, and it's something the cannabis industry could look for, because no one wants to have the same cannabis over and over again, but you have to have what your really core strengths are. If you have a few strains that you're really great at producing, then you should produce those, but you need to offer the consumers some variability. And so just like the craft beer industry, it's a great chance.
So, but in these industries, obviously, I imagine there's a lot of varieties that people are interested in. There's a lot of different grow techniques that's required in order to maximize the performance and the taste and the performance of these crops. How can you do that in a traditional environment?
Well, it's definitely challenging, and it goes to the different strategies of cultivation that people have selected. And traditionally, the cultivation facility designs that I've seen, that I've been through, involve separated vegetative and flowering rooms, multiple flowering rooms, usually in multiples of or divisibles of 8, so that you have an 8-week maturation cycle. So you'd have 8 flower rooms, you'd have the vegetative rooms to support that. It's a very traditional way to have an ongoing production.
Is there a better way?
I definitely think there is, because if you only have a few rooms and you have multiple genetics you need to produce, because as much as people enjoy Coors, even Coors has lots of different product lines. And so just as much as cannabis consumers enjoy cannabis, they want to have different varieties, whether that's because of the different chemical profiles, the different flavors, or the different effects that they're seeking. And so if you only have a room that comes down once a week and you're trying to get a consistent amount of production as well as supply a diversity of the product portfolio, then you're going to be limited to be putting in multiple genetics in those rooms, which is really suboptimal because you can't dial in what's best for each variety. If your lemon lava cake really prefers 85 degrees, but your Afghani-based Kittrell Kush is going to do best at 78, then unfortunately, if you're growing them both in the same room, one of them is going to be too hot and one of them is going to be too cold, and you're just not going to get those optimal results. So
what do you do? Just give it the average and hope for good enough? Is that the best they can do?
Well, good enough leads to market attrition, because good enough isn't going to be good enough to succeed long term. So the producers that are going to succeed are going to dial in their cultivation and supply the exact environment to the right strain for that strain. Now, how do you do that? And the way you do that is through the incorporation of technology. And again, like Agrify's growth chambers, our vertical farming units not only allow efficient use of space, both through the length and width square footage of your facility, but they stack vertically and incorporate a catwalk system for very easy access. And in each one of these growth chambers, you can have a different strain, a different cultivation environment, different parameters selected, and all of it is driven through a very complex systems engineered software hardware solution that records hundreds of thousands, almost 1 million data points a year at minimum. And with all of that data, you have the ability to parse through what did well, what didn't, how to repeat that successful harvest, what environmental factors, what cultivation practices were followed. Everything is recorded for you. So it really maximizes both the production capability, your ability to maximize genetics, but also it allows you to treat each genetic as its own and to elicit its best performance, the highest quality and the greatest degree of consistency from crop to crop, from state to state.
One other thing you touched on earlier was also on resources and potential wasted resources. So where does the vertical farm unit come into play with that?
So one of the things that the system does is it takes advantages of the vertical space in the facility and maximizes the area, that the grow area, without spreading it out or a long area. So a lot of less transportation. It also allows you the ability to have vegetative and flower in the same unit. You can adjust the parameters on the fly, so you're not moving products over and over. But I think one of the most unique things it does is it has labor utilization software built into it, so that your cycle isn't dependent on a weekly cycle of turning over a room or a large effort that's associated with that. You can get down to hourly or daily tasks and really maximize the labor utilization within your facility. David, do you have additional?
Absolutely. I think that when we're looking at what technology can be incorporated to make these cultivators, these operators successful, incorporating vertical technology that uses the space efficiently, it's much easier to incorporate and to run an operation from one facility that's producing a larger amount than it is to manage multiple smaller facilities across a diverse geography. And then in relation to that environmental control, without a system like Agrify that does the data amalgamation for you, that collects all of the data, that automates your irrigation and your CO2 and your environment and gives you access, you're left trying to piece together, some technology that really was never designed to work together. And unfortunately, trying to get your air conditioning system to talk to your lights, to talk to your HVAC and your dehumidification, it becomes challenging because they were never designed to work together. They were designed by different companies. So having this systems engineered approach that delivers all of the cutting edge technology at your fingertips, as well as a very useful software platform to go through that data to operate your facility, I think is how operators are really going to succeed as the market moves forward.
Mm-hmm. In addition to the precision environment, I think one of the things that's critical is that I think there's a lot of optimization that still needs to take place in the industry. Obviously, everybody has an idea of how to grow items, but there's always a better way. With the individualized, compartmentalized units within the Agrify system, but still at a commercial level, it now gives the ability for the growers to dial in day by day, hour by hour, to make changes between one unit and the other unit to really find out what's the optimal performance for the system.
That's a great point, Rob. And it goes right to our assertion that data is key and the reproduction of what you learn from that data, because it's great to understand what you did right, but it's a real pain if you can never do it again. And so I think when we talk about that reproducibility and we talk about that data, they really do go hand in hand.
I would agree.
Great. Well, I think we've pretty much summed it up. I appreciate you, Rob and David, coming on today to talk with the audience at Growth about cultivation technology. It seems like things are heading in the right direction, and Agrify really has their finger on the pulse when it comes to evolving and meeting the market's needs. So pretty exciting stuff.
Thank you.
Absolutely, Rachel. Thank you so much for having us.